So if there's no questions about that, let's go ahead and start some new material today. If I can get this computer to work. Okay. All right, so like I said, we're moving into this topic today on called measuring economic activity, and I'll get into what I mean by that a bit more here in a minute. Just to kind of put this stuff into context, so we've spent, I guess, the first few weeks of the semester really talking about microeconomics or reviewing some basic concepts from microeconomics. Micro is basically the study of how individuals in our economy, whether they be households or businesses, interact with one another in markets, right? Microeconomics is very much the study of how individuals make decisions in the real world. Macroeconomics is something very different, right? This is the study of kind of economy-wide phenomena, things like inflation, or interest rates, taxes, monetary policy, fiscal policy like government spending, debts, deficits, stuff like that. These are all macro economic topics. Now, traditionally, these two courses at the principles levels are separated from one another. And we do this at Alabama, right? Now, when I was in college, I actually just took a principles of economics class that in truth was mostly micro with a little bit of macro. But most schools today kind of split these two into two separate classes. But micro and macroeconomics are obviously linked, right? Why is that? Well, if you think about it, the macroeconomy is really nothing more than the sum or the aggregation, if you will, of all these different individual decision makers in our economy. All the different households, all the different firms as they interact with one another in markets makes up the entire macro economy. I think this has an important implication, right? And that being that the basic micro tools that you study in microeconomics, things like supply and demand, equilibrium, what else have we talked about? Opportunity cost, how rational agents think at the margin. All of those different microeconomic tools and concepts also apply in a very similar way to macroeconomics, which is going to be helpful for us as we move forward through this class. Okay, now before we actually begin trying to develop theories or tell, sophisticated stories about how the macroeconomy works, the first thing we need to do is actually observe how the macroeconomy is behaving, right? That makes sense. How can we ever attempt to explain something in the real world if we don't first make an observation on that, right? What's the story is Isaac Newton saw the apple fall from the tree before he could try to develop a theory of gravity, okay? We want to do something on not quite as grand a scale in this class. Well, how does one observe the macroeconomy? What do I mean by that? How do we observe what's going on in the macroeconomy? Well, go ahead. Sorry? Yeah, so we can look at GDP, which is an example of certain types of macroeconomic data, right? We want to try to observe the trends and the cycles that the macroeconomy goes through. And so what we need to do is make reference to specific data, okay? Now, in this section of the course, which we'll spend today talking about as well as Thursday, we're going to discuss one piece of data, right? What the gentleman on the fifth row here already described, and that is GDP, or gross domestic product. I'm sure if you guys have paid attention to anything that's in the financial news in recent years, you will have at least heard of this statistic before, gross domestic product. We're going to get into the details about what that is today, what kinds of transactions are included in GDP, what kinds of things get excluded, and so on and so forth. Okay, first things first. When you guys hear about GDP in the news, right, it's obviously supposed to reflect how well the economy is performing, right? We can think of it as a summary statistic, a specific number that gives us some indication of how kind of healthy the economy is, right? We use GDP to kind of monitor the overall health of the economy, right? When GDP is high, when it's a big number, or more realistically, when it's growing quickly, then we get the sense that our economy is performing well. Economic activity is robust and vibrant, right? When GDP is low, or when it's growing slowly, or even when its growth is negative, so GDP is falling, then the opposite is the sentiment, right? We think that the economy is probably not performing as well. Maybe economic activity is declining, maybe people are losing their jobs, etc. Does anyone know what GDP was for the most recent, so for 2019? We don't have complete data for 2020 yet. That's obvious, right? But any guesses about what U.S. gross domestic product was for 2019? Matt? Say again? So it's in the trillions, but it was a bit higher than that. Closer to around 22 or 23 trillion dollars. That's with a T, right? Not with a B, right? Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, his net worth, Matt, I think is what, 100 billion, maybe 150 billion dollars, right? U.S. gross domestic product is orders of magnitude larger than that. It's closer to 20 to 21, 22 trillion dollars per year, okay? So it's a huge number, all right? Now, I've already told you essentially what type of number GDP is. It's obviously measured in dollars, right? When we talk about gross domestic product, we're not talking about quantity of a certain type of good, right? The unit of measurement is in US dollars, right? It's a single number measured in dollars that's supposed to give us some indication about kind of how well the economy is performing. Here's the first really important kind of conceptual question I want you guys to think about today. What does that 22 or 23 trillion dollars actually reflect? When we say US GDP is 22 trillion dollars, what do we mean by that? Is that how much money is circulating in the economy, like the money supply? Is that, you know, the total value of the US stock market, right? What does that 22 or 23 trillion dollars actually reflect? Where's it coming from? You guys know? This really gets at the heart of what gross domestic product is, what it's supposed to represent. Matt? Yeah, so it's the value of all goods and services traded or bought. So that's certainly one way of thinking about GDP. I think what Matt is saying here is that GDP measures the total expenditure on the economy's total output of actual goods and services. So if we were somehow able to go out and tabulate up all of the goods and services that are bought within a given period of time in the US economy, and we add up the total prices for everything, right? Compute the whole value of that national shopping list, if you will, that would tell us what gross domestic product is, okay? However, let me say this, gross domestic product actually measures something else as well. GDP measures the total income of everyone who is participating in the economy. So whereas GDP measures not only total income of everyone in the economy, it also measures the economy's total expenditure on its output of actual goods and services. Now, that's a little bit confusing. How is it that GDP, this is a distinct economic concept, how can it possibly represent two different things at the same time, right? Income is one thing. That's what you get for your hours that you work, right? Expenditure is something else. That's what you're paying for actual goods and services that you're consuming. How is it that GDP can measure both income and the economy's total expenditures simultaneously? Beth, go ahead. Okay, so I think Neff is honing in on the right answer here. Okay, let me just kind of describe it a little bit more abstractly. So, Neff, if I tell you that A is equal to B, and A is also equal to C, what does that imply about the relationship between B and C? They have to be equal, right? And so that's kind of what's going on here, is that GDP measures total income in the economy, and it measures the total expenditures of goods and services because, as Neff has described here, those two things, income and expenditure at the aggregate level, have to be equal to one another, okay? For the economy as a whole, this is the first kind of major fundamental idea from this section that you need to know and for sure will be tested on. For the economy as a whole, income equals expenditure. Now, what's the intuition there? Neff hit on this, right? It's every transaction that takes place in our economy has basically two parties, right? A buyer and a seller. The expenditure for the buyer necessarily becomes the income for the seller. And so if you add up the economy's total expenditure, you should have the same number as the economy's total income of those goods and services, right? If Neff hired me to fix the roof on her house, and I charged her $1,500 for that service, then that transaction will contribute $1,500 to GDP, whether we regard it as expenditures for Neff or income for me. We would not want to include both income and expenditure. Why? Because we would be double counting the same actual transaction, right? So GDP can be thought of as total income or total expenditure, because for the economy as a whole, those two things have to be equal to one another. Now be careful about this. Obviously, at the individual level, income doesn't have to equal expenditures, right? For some of us, our income exceeds our own expenditures. When that happens, what are we doing? We're actually saving some of our income, right? For others, their expenditure exceeds their income. In that case, they are drawing down their savings, or perhaps they're even borrowing to finance those extra expenditures. Right, so this does not have to be true for every individual person in the economy, but for the economy overall, this identity should hold here, is that aggregate or total income must equal total expenditure. Both of them then reflect gross domestic product. Okay, there is another way to conceptualize GDP that I think is useful, and to do this, we need to go back to a simple model that you guys reviewed and actually took a quiz on earlier in the semester, and that is this circular flow diagram of income and spending, okay? Now, just again, really quickly, what is the circular flow diagram? It's about the easiest economic model to work with. It's not even really a model, okay? What it basically is an illustration that shows us kind of how the macroeconomy is organized, how it's structured, and how different decision makers in the economy interact with one another. Okay, so really quickly, remember the circular flow diagram basically has two types of decision makers. One is comprised of households in the private sector. The other is comprised of firms, okay, businesses. What is it that households are doing in the economy, as described by the circular flow diagram? Well, households own these things called factors of production, all right, which they sell or rent to firms in exchange for income. Now, what are the economy's main factors of production? Well, the most important is probably labor, right? The hours that you guys put into your work for paid income. Another factor of production is capital, right? This is stuff like warehouses, equipment, computers that are used by workers in the production process. Another factor of production would be perhaps labor. So those are the main three: land, labor, and capital. Money is not a factor of production. You can't factors of production are those things that businesses can use that they can transform into actual goods and services. Households then use their income and to buy goods that are purchased by firms, and then they consume them, right? And generate utility from doing so. What is it that firms do in our economy? Well, they buy or hire the factors of production. They purchase land, labor, and capital from households. They use them to produce goods and services, or they transform those inputs into outputs, and then they sell them back to the household sector for revenue, right? Okay, so those are the two main decision makers in the macroeconomy, as illustrated in this circular flow diagram. The other useful thing about this particular diagram is it shows exactly how these two decision makers interact with one another, okay? Now, one way they interact is through something called the markets for factors of production. By the way, that's when agents are interacting with one another in the economy, they're always doing so through markets, okay? There's two broad types of markets in our economy. One is the market for factors of production, right? What happens in that market? The factors of production, land, labor, and capital, are transferred to firms in exchange for income payments, right? Which I have labeled here as wages, rent, and profit. Wages and salary, that's of course the payment to labor. Rents are what economists refer to as the payments to owners of capital, okay? Why do I have profit, though, flowing back towards the household sector? Do you guys remember, how do we define profit in economics? You guys remember? Yeah. What's your name again? Sean, sorry. Okay, so in that case, you can earn positive profit, but specifically what profit refers to is the gap between a firm's revenue and its costs, right? So if the revenue or benefits exceed the costs, then you have positive profit. So profits are firms' revenue minus their underlying costs. So it sounds to me like profits are what firms should retain after they've paid for the factors of production, right? Well, why does it ultimately flow back to households in the form of income, though? Shouldn't profits stay with the firms? Matt? Yeah. Who owns firms? People own firms, right? Like Milton Friedman, I remember one time when he was arguing against corporate income taxes, right? He always thought corporate income taxes should be zero. And people railed against him. But his basic idea here was that corporations don't pay taxes. Doesn't matter what the tax rate is. People pay taxes, right? It's people that are owners of these firms, right? Through stockholders, right, or whatnot. And so, or if it's a private company that is owned by an individual or a group of individuals, that's where they derive their income from, right? If you own a small business, right? So Matt, let's say you drop out of school and you open up a bakery, okay? Whatever profits your bakery earns, that's your income, because you also are a member of the household sector. So all wages, rents, and profit ultimately flow back to the household sector because firms are owned by households. Not evenly. Some individuals don't own any share of firms. Others own a lot. How else do households and firms interact with one another? Well, through traditional markets that you guys are all familiar with, and that is the market for goods and services, right? Here, firms supply or sell goods and services to households, and households pay for those products with money, right? Spending, which becomes revenue for firms. Okay, now the reason why I wanted to show you this picture is because I think it's very intuitive how to visualize gross domestic product in our economy. GDP is this continual flow of dollars from households to firms in the form of total expenditures, right, on goods and services, but it's also matched by the flow of dollars from firms back to households in terms of income or payments to factors of production. Our economy is constantly churning. There are dollars that are flowing from households to firms and then back to households constantly, right? Gross domestic product is that flow of dollars through markets over a given period of time. Whether you want to think about it in terms of income or total expenditure, those flows should be equal in the aggregate. Okay, questions about that? So let me stay on this topic of the circular flow diagram for a minute, because I think this is a useful point to question some of the assumptions of this model, right? So whenever an economist presents a model to try to explain what's happening in the world, one of the first things you want to do is start to question, well, what are some of the underlying assumptions there, okay? Here, the circular flow diagram omits some key features of our economy. Do those omissions affect our understanding of GDP? What are some things that the circular flow diagram leaves out that affect our lives in a big way? As an example, I heard somebody say taxes, right? Yeah, there's no government here, right? So, Neff, some of your income, not all of your income is used to purchase goods and services, right? Some of it is actually taxed by the government. So you can think of as a government sector being somewhere here in the middle that siphons off some of this income. But what does the government do? They don't just store all of that money or those resources, right? They turn around and buy stuff from firms. So there's a government sector here that siphons income off from the household sector, but also purchases goods and services from the business sector. So yeah, it's leaving out a government and taxes and government spending. What else? Is anything else omitted from this model? I don't remember. What's your name? Alex, sorry. Say again? Okay, yeah. So later on in the semester, we're going to talk about something called the financial system. This is a critical component of the macroeconomy, okay? I think that's sort of what you're hitting on here. Not all of our income is used to spend on goods, nor is it used to spend just on taxes, right? Some of it, for some of us, is going to be saved, right? And that is kind of meaning you're going to deposit it into the financial system, whether you put it in a savings account or you buy financial securities or other types of assets, right? So there are these financial intermediaries that also receive income from households. But what we're going to discover in talking about the financial system is that many firms will actually borrow resources directly from the financial system, from banks and whatnot, in order to finance spending on things like capital investment projects, new equipment, new warehouses, new office buildings, etc. And so, yeah, there's also a financial component of our macroeconomy that's extremely important. I can think of a third one, a foreign component. Not everything we buy is produced by domestic firms. Some of the stuff we buy, a lot of the stuff we buy is produced abroad. Moreover, not everything that is sold by domestic firms is sold to domestic households. Some of the stuff that our firms domestically produce gets sold abroad. So the circular flow diagram is also omitting an international flow of goods and services. All right, those are some of the assumptions we've made in describing how the macroeconomy is organized. But what I'll tell you is this, is that even though we've left out a government sector, we've left out temporarily a financial system, as well as a foreign sector, the basic principle still applies. Every transaction that takes place in our economy, whether it's an individual living in the US, whether it's someone representing the government, whether it's a foreign resident, or whether it's a firm, has two parties, a buyer and a seller, all right? So when you add up both sides of the ledger here, total expenditures should be equal to total income. That's actually not completely true once we allow the foreign sector to come into play. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but when we talk about open economy, macroeconomic concepts towards the later end of the semester, this idea of income and spending doesn't always have to be perfectly equal, but that's a special case of what we're talking about here today. So we can push that off until later in the semester. Okay, you guys have any questions then so far? So that's really the first key idea I want to hammer into your brains, is this idea that at the macroeconomic level, income and expenditure are the same thing. And that the flows of income and the flows of spending is what we mean by, or how we measure, in a sense, gross domestic product. That's what GDP is supposed to reflect, those income and spending flows for the total economy. All right, you guys have any questions so far? Pretty straightforward. Okay, the second part of this section of the course really gets into more of the details about how we formally define gross domestic product. We have a general concept of what GDP is now. It's income, it's also equal to total expenditures. But we're ready now to focus on more of a formal definition of GDP as used by the actual government when they're trying to estimate and publish these statistics. Okay, now it's useful to talk about the specific definition for a variety of reasons, but I think most importantly, the reason is because only by looking at the specific definition and studying it in detail can we see what kinds of transactions get included and what kinds of transactions get excluded from our notion of GDP. I think that's important because what it's going to highlight is the fact that GDP is not really a perfect measure of overall economic activity. It is probably the best we have, but it's not going to pick up every type of economic transaction that occurs in our economy. There are certain things that are left out for very good reason, but what it implies then is that GDP is only going to be somewhat of an imperfect or flawed measure of the total well-being of an economy. All right, we can only really understand that, I think, at a deeper level if we go through the definition piece by piece. And so that's what I want to do for the next several minutes of class today. Okay, so how is gross domestic product then defined by the government statistical agencies that are in charge with trying to estimate it? Well, GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. All right, so that's a lot to digest there. I think what I want to do is go through this definition kind of one component at a time so that you really understand the implications of every feature of this definition, okay? The first one that I want to focus on is this idea that GDP is supposed to somehow measure the market value of stuff, all right? Let's focus on this idea of GDP reflecting market value first. Okay, so earlier today, we talked about how gross domestic product is a single number. It's measured in US dollars, and it's supposed to somehow tell us the overall health of the economy, okay? If we think of GDP in terms of spending, we obviously buy tons and tons of different types of goods and services. But if GDP is a single number measured in dollars, then kind of implicit in its construction is some way to make a comparison between all of these different types of goods and services that we consume, right? In other words, GDP, whether you think about it or not, is actually comparing the value of things like computers to the value of car tires and bread and concert tickets, etc. How does it do that? How does GDP compare the market value of all of these wildly different types of goods and services? Well, the way it does this is by actually using prevailing market prices, right? With the idea that market value should be reflected in market prices. Now, let me switch away actually from the slides for a moment, because I don't have this in the slides. I'm going to go over here to the document camera for just a moment. To try to explain to you why actual market prices are used as basically a proxy or our best estimate of what the market value of all these different goods and services are, okay? I'm going to try to illustrate this with a basic supply and demand model, something that you guys are all familiar with. Let's pretend that this is the market for desktop computers, okay? Here is the downward sloping demand for computers. Here is the upward sloping supply. Now, if we assume that this market works like a regular market, which should adjust to meet equilibrium, then what do we know is going to happen? Is that the price should move around to balance supply and demand, just like we talked about in the last class, okay? So if we view the world through this lens, then what we're saying here is that the actual market price of computers that we observe should be somewhere close to the true equilibrium price, all right? Now, in what sense does that represent value or reflect value? Let's think about this for a second. According to my supply and demand model, what is the value of the Q first computer, if you will? In other words, what's the value of a computer to the marginal buyer in this market? Well, you simply trace up to the demand curve and over, right? Remember, that's why market demand curves slope down, because recall, when we talked about supply and demand, as price falls, people who have a lower value on those goods start to enter the market, okay? And so to the marginal buyer, a computer is worth exactly P1. Well, what is the cost of supplying the Q first computer? In other words, what's the cost to the marginal seller in this market? Same principle. We trace up to the supply curve and over. So the value to the marginal buyer is P1. The cost to the marginal seller is also P1. And so the basic supply and demand model tells us then that in equilibrium, the price that prevails should reflect true market value, right? That's the basic reason why we use actual market prices as a proxy, if you will, for market value when we're trying to think about gross domestic product. I'm still not great at moving back and forth between this stuff, so just bear with me for 1 sec. Okay. All right, so that's the main point there, is that goods are valued at their market prices. And so the way we can compare the market value of all these different goods and services is we basically just sum up the actual market prices as observed between buyers and sellers, which is why we can express GDP in terms of a single dollar value. Okay, now there's a big implication of this result. And that is that things that aren't actually sold in organized legal markets get excluded from our measure of GDP, okay? So housework, for example, that you do on your own, that's an economic activity that is not reflected in gross domestic product. But if you hire a maid to clean your home, that transaction gets included in GDP, even though the exact same economic activity were to take place, right? If you purchase illegal or illicit products, right, like illegal street drugs, for example, that's an underground economy that might be worth technically billions of dollars a year in the US economy, but it's not included in our measure of gross domestic product because it's not sold in an organized or a legal market, right? If I grow a head of lettuce in my garden and eat it, that makes no contribution to GDP, right? Because there's nothing that is exchanged in an organized market between buyer and seller. If I go to the grocery store and purchase the same type of lettuce for $3 and eat it, that activity contributes $3 to gross domestic product. So this is kind of the first example of where we have the same type of economic activity taking place, but only some of it actually counts towards GDP. So to the extent that there's a lot of goods and services sold in markets that aren't organized or possibly illegal, then our measure of gross domestic product is actually going to understate kind of the true value of the economy or how much economic activity is actually taking place. Okay, questions then about that? The second part of the definition that I want to focus on for a minute here is this idea that GDP is supposed to reflect the market value of all final goods and services. I think this is best illustrated with an example, okay? Let's suppose that the North Face company purchases $35 worth of fabric from some manufacturer. North Face then takes that fabric and uses it to construct a jacket that it sells to Matt for $100. So two transactions have taken place here. The $35 purchase of fabric and the $100 purchase by Matt of the jacket. What is the total contribution then to GDP of this activity? Is it $35? Is it $100? Is it $135? What do you think? Matt? Why? Okay, so what Matt's getting at here, I think, is that it's important to understand the distinction between what is regarded as a final good in our economy. That's a good that is intended for the end user, right? When Matt purchases the jacket, he intends to use it. It's a final good. He's not going to turn around and sell it to, what's your name again? Josh. I may do that several times this semester until I start to learn more names. I learn names and then I forget them. That's what a final good is. That's very different than an intermediate good, okay? An intermediate good is a good that's used as a component or an ingredient in the production of other goods. In our modern economy, we have multiple stages of production, okay? Raw materials are transformed into intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are sold to other producers to produce final goods. Final goods are then sold to customers, retail at the retail level, for example, okay? Gross domestic product is supposed to only reflect the market value of final goods and services, not intermediate goods. Now, Matt, I think you actually went a little bit further in your explanation, and that is, why do we actually want to exclude the value of the intermediate good transaction? In other words, so why doesn't this make a $135 contribution to GDP instead of just a $100 contribution? I think I heard you say it in your answer. Perfect, right? Part of the $100 cost of the jacket includes the $35 cost or value of the intermediate goods that was used to make it. So what would happen then if we count not only final goods but intermediate goods, we would be doing what? We would actually be double counting the market value of intermediate goods. So it's not true that we're ignoring the value of intermediate goods. Be careful about that. Intermediate goods are part of GDP. The point is that the value of these intermediate goods are already built in to the price of the final good, right? So we would be double counting all of the intermediate goods if we added up the final good transaction plus the intermediate good transaction. This suggests an alternative way to compute GDP, right? Instead of taking the market value of all the final goods, what we could do is take the market value added at each stage of production. So the sale of the intermediate good at the first stage of production, plus the value added of the final good. That is the difference between the $100 jacket and the $35 fabric, right? So the value of the intermediate good there would be 35. What would be the value added then that North Face applies to the jacket? Not $100, but $65, right? That's the final good price minus the intermediate good cost. Okay? You guys have any questions about that so far? So we've got two pieces of this definition down now, I think. That GDP is the market value of final goods and services, right? Where we use actual market prices as a measure of market value. Let me move to the next part of the definition, and that is this idea that GDP not only reflects the value of final goods, but also services. This is something that you want to keep in mind because as our economy evolves and transforms over time, it's turned out that we're actually supplying and purchasing more of these services these days than we are of actual goods, okay? So GDP includes tangible items. This is what we mean by goods. Physical stuff, so things like cell phones or bikes or beer or other types of food. These are actual physical, tangible goods that are sold. The market value of all that stuff is obviously part of gross domestic product. But GDP also includes the market value of all of these intangible services, right? Meaning stuff like your dry cleaning bill, your concerts that you go to, your cell phone service, a therapy session, a spa treatment, right? A fitness center membership, tennis lessons. All of those things are services. They're intangible products, right? The market value of all of that stuff also gets included in gross domestic product. GDP includes the market value of all final goods and services that are actually produced. Now, I'm emphasizing the word produced to draw a distinction here between goods and services that are currently produced versus goods that were produced at some point in the past, okay? And so GDP includes all new products and services. It's not going to include, as an implication then, any items that are used or were previously sold to an end user, right? So, for example, if you were to purchase an existing home, not a newly built home, even though that existing home might cost you $400,000, that transaction doesn't add to current GDP. If you were to buy a used car, even if that car cost you $25,000, that doesn't make a contribution to current GDP. On a lower scale, if you buy anything from a garage sale or a secondhand store or something like this, these are used items. The market value of those transactions don't get incorporated into GDP. The idea here is we want gross domestic product to reflect current production. That is today's kind of productive capacity of the economy. We don't want to include existing home sales. Why? Because the market value of that house or the market value of that used car was already included in GDP the year that it was actually made. Okay? So GDP is supposed to reflect current production, not past production. So only newly produced goods and services. Here's one that's pretty straightforward. So GDP is supposed to reflect the market value of stuff that's produced within the geographic borders of a particular country. That's what gross domestic product is. It does not matter the nationality of the individual or group of individuals that is responsible for that production. As long as it takes place within the geographic borders of the US, it's part of US GDP. A French chef working in Paris comes to New York for the year. The market value of the meals that are prepared at that restaurant in New York are counted as part of US GDP, despite the fact that the chef is a citizen of France. It's not part of French GDP, right? If I were to quit this job and go and move to Paris and open up a coffee shop, right, the value of my services or the amount of income that I make in Paris would count towards France's GDP, not US GDP. On a bigger scale, any foreign-owned company that has operations domestically, the income that is generated from that operation is going to count towards US GDP, right? We have right down the highway here a massive automobile plant from Mercedes, right? That's a German corporation. The market value of the automobiles that come off that assembly line don't count towards German GDP, they count towards US GDP, because that is economic activity that's taking place here in the US, right? This always kind of drove me crazy when I would hear from folks that said, you need to buy an American car, right? Well, Mercedes is an American car. It's made right here in Alabama, okay? It's part of our US GDP, all right? It's not part of Germany's GDP. Matt, do you have a question? Somebody had a question. Was it you? Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Well, I'm not sure what, in the actual economy, they have parts that are produced all over the world that get shipped to the United States. The stuff is assembled here and then sold anywhere. Well, okay, so yes, and there are, I think what you're getting at here is that in the real world, a lot of the stuff that is sold in domestic markets gets, some of the intermediate goods are shipped from abroad. And so the actual value added to US GDP then would be the difference between the final sale price and the cost of those intermediate goods that may have been purchased in a foreign country. I haven't gotten into that detail for this class, but there is that going on. That the Bureau of Economic Analysis, this is the agency in Washington D.C. that estimates GDP. They take those things into account. And yes, in a modern economy like ours, where we get intermediate goods from all over the world, these kinds of things are factored into the analysis. We'll touch on it a little bit when we talk about net exports here towards the end of the class and how that's accounted for in GDP. But it also affects the value of intermediate goods as well. Let me just mention one last thing about GDP, and I don't have this in the slides, but up until about 1992, the headline measure of economic activity that people studied in undergraduate classes and that people talked about in the financial media was not gross domestic product, but it was something called gross national product, or GNP, right? When your parents took econ in college, they studied GNP, not GDP. There is a subtle distinction between those two, and for most countries, the numbers aren't tremendously different, but for some countries, they are. What gross national product is, imagine if you take GDP and you add to GDP all of the income that is earned by US nationals working abroad in France or Saudi Arabia or Russia. And then you subtract out all of the income earned by foreign nationals, that French chef working in New York from my earlier example. What you're left with is gross national product. So what GNP is essentially the total income of all of a country's citizens, regardless of where they're actually working in the world, all right? GDP is the better measure of how much domestic production is actually taking place, though. And for the US economy, the numbers aren't significantly different, but for some countries that have a lot of multinationals working in them or working out of those countries, GNP can be somewhat different than GDP. Though you'll watch a video towards the end of the next class that talks about this distinction a little bit more. So we'll come back to this in the next class. One final point about this definition that I want to mention, and it's particularly relevant given the published estimates of GDP that you're seeing in recent weeks, and that is that GDP is supposed to reflect income and spending over a given period of time. It's a flow of dollars over a particular period. Now, the convention is that GDP is supposed to reflect income and spending over a given year, okay? But in truth, what actually happens is that the agencies responsible for publishing it actually publish GDP estimates every 3 months, that is every quarter, okay? But be very careful about how you interpret these estimates. These estimates that come out every quarter don't tell you specifically what GDP was for that 3-month period. These are numbers that have been what's called annualized, all right? Basically, they're multiplying these values by 4 to express these quarterly figures at an annual rate, okay? Now, where that can be confusing is when you're looking at published GDP growth figures. These numbers like $23 trillion don't mean anything to most Americans. What we pay attention to more or less is the actual growth rate. Is GDP growing at 2% per year, 5%, 0%? What is it? Well, if you guys have been paying attention to the news recently, I think the last quarter's estimate of GDP growth in the US was something like negative 30%, a tremendous drop in GDP. That does not mean that GDP fell by 1/3 last quarter, because that number has been annualized. What it suggests is that if the economy continued to collapse at the same pace for a 12-month period, then GDP would fall by 1/3. But more likely what's going to happen is it's going to recover somewhat. So the actual quarterly drop in GDP was something around 8%. But what was actually quoted in the press was something like 30 or 31 or 32% drop in GDP. And I remember when this was published, the very day, you had a ton of people like on Twitter who were claiming that GDP had fallen by 1/3. Well, they were misinterpreting these annualized numbers that are reported every quarter. So just bear that in mind. Okay, you guys have any questions then about the formal definition of GDP? I don't like to say that you should commit anything to memory, but you really should be familiar with this definition and understand the implications of all of its parts, okay? And really the thing I want to re-emphasize here is understanding, using the definition to try to understand what kind of transactions get excluded from GDP and what kinds of things it actually measures. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes left in class today, so let me move on to the next part of the chapter, and that is talking about the actual components of the spending side of GDP. So economists are not always just interested in the working definition of GDP or in the total GDP number, right, or in its growth rate. But rather what we would like to take a look at in a little bit more detail is how that spending is broken down or allocated among alternative uses in our economy, okay? In this class, what you'll need to know is that GDP on the spending side can be broken down into 4 components, all right? The first is consumption, which I'm going to denote with a C. The next is investment spending, which I'll denote with an I. Government purchases, G, and then this thing called net exports, which we'll label NX. This is I guess this is the first equation then that you'll see in this class. And it's that real gross domestic product, and I'll get into this distinction about real versus nominal GDP in the next class, but for right now, you just need to know that gross domestic product, which I'm going to denote with a variable Y, that's just kind of the convention in economics, is the sum of these 4 components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This equation is what's called an identity in economics. We call something an identity because what's on the left-hand side is equal to what's on the right-hand side simply by virtue of the way we've defined the variables. Some equations in economics are like equilibrium conditions, right? Like when we talk about supply and demand, the key equilibrium condition out of that model is that quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Well, that doesn't have to be true in reality all the time, right? It's just the prediction of a specific model. This does not come out of any model of the economy. This equation is true because of the way we've defined the variables. It's an identity that always has to hold. And the reason is because every dollar that is spent in our economy has to fall into at least one of these 4 categories. And so the sum of all of that spending is going to be equal to GDP. Some equations in economics are equilibrium conditions. Some are like budget constraints. Others are identities. This is what's known as an identity, or an example of one. Okay, let me spend some time talking about consumption spending first. This is the most important component of GDP. Consumption is defined as spending by households on goods and services. So the spending by the household sector in our economy on final goods and services makes up the consumption spending component of GDP. It includes basically 3 types of goods. One is a non-durable good, like food and clothing. We have durable goods, like automobiles, computers, large appliances. And we also have services, spa treatments, therapy sessions, etc. So durables, non-durables, and services make up total consumption spending. That's pretty straightforward. Now, let me talk for a few minutes about the most important component of consumption spending, and it falls in the services category, and that is our spending on what's called housing services. We basically have 2 types of individuals or participants in our economy. Those people who rent their dwelling, or those people who live in owner-occupied housing, okay? For most college students, you guys live in a dorm or an apartment that you are renting, okay? How do we compute the value of your housing services if you are a renter? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically just your rent payments, right? Like any other good, we use market prices to convey something about market value. So if your rent is, I don't know, what's the rent around here for a 2-bedroom apartment in Tuscaloosa now? Like $1,200 a month or something? I have no idea. Let's say it's $1,200 a month. Then that reflects the market value then of the housing services that you're dwelling provides you every single month. So for people who rent, your rent payments are a part of your consumption spending, and it falls in the services component of consumption. Just by a show of hands, does anybody here live in owner-occupied housing? Do any of you guys live in a place that you own, or maybe that your parents own? Am I the only one? My parents don't own my house. I own my house, thankfully. That's different, right? I don't pay rent to anyone. So how does the government figure out what the market value of the housing services that I'm receiving is going to be? Any guesses, Matt? Property tax, that might be a noisy measure, but no. It's related to that, but not exactly. Yeah, Sean? Okay, that has something to do with it as well. Essentially, here's the way it works. The government has to figure out, these statistical agencies have to figure out what the rental value of my property would be. They estimate it, and that is the value of the housing services that my dwelling provides. So Sean, it would almost be a situation where like I paid myself rent every month, right? I take $2,000 from my right hand and put it into my left hand, right? There is the transaction. I'm basically paying myself because I'm also the owner of the house, okay? And that $2,000 is the estimated rental value of my home. So that's essentially the market value then of the housing services that your dwelling provides you. That's the thing you need to think about here, is that wherever we live, whether it's an apartment or a condo or a home or even a tent somewhere, that those dwellings provide a stream of services to the resident for as long as they live there, right? The bigger, the nicer the house, the more valuable those services are, obviously. So just make sure you guys understand that, is that for renters, your rent payments are the biggest portion of consumption spending, but for homeowners, it's the imputed or estimated rental value of your home. That, Matt, I didn't want to dodge your point. The estimated rental value is one of the factors that determines property taxes, but it's not the only thing. Importantly, it's not things like your mortgage payment or your interest. That's not how the housing services are computed for people who own their own home. Investment. This is probably the last one I'll get to talk about today. This is defined as total spending on goods that will be used to produce other goods in the future, okay? Investment basically includes 4 categories that I want you to be somewhat familiar with. The first and most obvious is capital equipment. So things like machines, tools, those are the physical objects that workers use to build stuff, for instance, in factories. Capital equipment, that's part of investment spending, right? So when a firm purchases a bunch of new machines or tools, that goes to the investment spending component of GDP. Another category of investment spending are structures. This includes new factories, new office buildings, new warehouses, and also new homes for residential purposes. Let me reemphasize that. The rental value of your apartment or your home counts towards consumption spending, and it's part of the services component of consumption. However, when you first purchase that brand new home, it has to be new, not an existing home, right? If you purchase a new home, that actually, let's say it's $300,000 or $400,000, that purchase price is actually considered an investment in structures, in residential structures to be exact. And why does that make sense? When you purchase a home, you're making an investment for future housing services, because that house is going to render a flow of services to you for as long as you live in it. So when you first purchase the house, that's part of residential structures. That goes to the investment category. But the services you get thereafter are part of consumption. Intellectual property is a new-ish component of investment. That includes things like spending by firms on research and development, artistic originals, films, musical scores, artwork, stuff like that. This is also a component of investment. And the last one I want to talk about here is inventories. This is an important one. Spending on inventory adjustments is part of the investment component of GDP. Let me illustrate this with a quick example. Let's suppose that a shoe company like ASICS produces a pair of running shoes in 2020. They can't sell these shoes. No consumer decides to buy them in 2020. And so ASICS sticks those shoes into their inventory for 2020. In the next year, in 2021, they pull those shoes out of inventory and sell them to Matt. How is that transaction affected or accounted for in GDP? Remember, the basic definition of GDP is we want it to reflect current production, right? So the market value of the shoes should be counted towards GDP in the year they're produced. That's where we come into inventories, okay? When the shoe store or the shoe company first places those shoes into inventory, then you can think of the company as basically purchasing those shoes to place in its own inventory investment. And so GDP rises by the market value, the final sale price of the shoes. Let's say they're a $100 pair of shoes, okay? So that's an example of a firm purchasing one of its own items, essentially, for its inventory. And GDP goes up by the market value of the good or the product. The next year, when the shoe store sells these shoes to Matt, then two things are happening. Matt's consumption's going up by 100, right? But the shoe company's inventory investment is falling by 100. Those two offset each other perfectly in 2021, and so there's no net effect on GDP in 2021. Where the effect is felt is in 2020, that is when the shoes were originally produced, okay? So what inventories, it's basically an accounting trick that allows us to count towards GDP goods that are produced this year but not actually sold to an end user until a later year, okay? One final point I want to make about this, and I don't want anybody to screw this up. Investment in econ does not mean the purchase of financial products like stocks and bonds. In your finance class, your finance professors may refer to that as investment. That's not what that's actually saving, okay? What investment is in an economics class is the purchase of goods that are used to produce future goods, whether it's equipment or machines or residential housing or inventories or whatever. The sum of those four give us total investment. Okay, I know I'm pushing up against the time limit here. Here's what we're going to do in the next class. There's two more components of GDP I want to talk about, government spending and net exports. We should get through those quickly. I want to show you guys some actual data on the four components of GDP for the US economy so you guys can get a sense about how large these components are. The last part of the class, we're going to study a distinction between real versus nominal GDP. Once we take into account the fact that prices of goods and services tend to go up over time due to inflation, that obscures this notion of GDP over time. And so we need a measure that corrects for that. And so we'll talk about what we mean by real versus nominal GDP. We should be able to get through all of that by the end of the next class, okay? Any final questions? Yeah, back row? No? Okay. All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday then. Thank you.